It was nearly dawn when a knock came to her door. Struggling to disentangle herself from sheets, Osrith was only just dressed in breeches and her shirt when she pulled on the door latch and peered into the bright sunlight. "Aren't you a little late for your duty, Osrith Lackland?" Finan stepped over the threshold, and waited until Osrith closed the door. He had many things planned, but none of them included the whole of the east end of the city watching them. And then he saw her face. Was she happy to see him? Finan took her hand, and Osrith smiled at last, letting go of the door. "Finan!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing in Winchester?" And he told her about the death of Ragnar, and how Utad had managed to find a way to kill Skade, and how he was in the process of trying to find out his brother's killer. It all sounded strange to Osrith as she thought about the fact that Utad and Ragnar considered each other as brothers, until Finan filled her in on that bit too. He went to help Ethelfled, of course, she deduced. Yes, Finan agreed. And because of that, Ragnar disowned him, telling him he was no longer a Dane if he considered putting Wessex above the oath he had sworn to be by his side when the great Hen army invaded. "You look quite unwell, Elaine," Finan said, as he stretched out an arm, and made to put it on her forearm. Osrith did not resist, but she did not encourage, either. If Utad was back in Winchester, however secretly, he would be hostile to her, having shamed him. She looked at Finan's face, which seemed to confirm her thoughts. "I feel it," Osrith admitted. "I just want to lie down. But I have guard duty soon." "I will send a message to the palace, to say you are unfit for duty," Finan said, and strode to the door, hailing a young boy who was playing in the street. Osrith saw him hand the boy something, and the child looked at Finan before running off down the street. Then he sat down beside Osrith, who had swung her legs back up onto the bed, before chancing his luck and lying beside her. When he met no resistance, he stroked Osrith's hair and began to sing a very quiet song by her ear. It had an up and down melody and Osrith understood most of the words. It was about a man with hair as black as a raven from Aryan, who had the love of one Kaelin. "But then they come to take her, don't they?" Osrith said, her mind almost in a trance. "Yes," Finan smiled, "but I always thought it was a happy song." Stay with me always, Osrith." "I can't promise on always," Osrith replied, sleepily. "We have spent a lot of time together," Finan broached, "yet never a child." "No, I fear." "You fear?" he repeated, and Osrith turned her face to look at him. Was it expectation on his face? Hope? Or outrage? "My life is very physical, and when I was very young I was in need of a healer with special abilities." "Your life in Pitland, with your great lord." "Young lord," Osrith corrected him. "Like Edward?" he proposed. "Not like Edward. Constantine could be no more like Edward than if it were designed to be so. A king of the north once broke the peace to be rid of a woman and his kin," Finan continued. "Aldfrith Flanfina. To marry another woman, and broke the church over her," Finan clarified. "Oswy of Northumbria. He made people choose," Osrith replied. "And lost a good deal of Bernicia to Alba, when those people chose the Irish church. Edward has done that, and Alfred has intervened. His new bride is pretty." Finan stroked Osrith's cheek. "Not broken the church, it causes a rift, and it will cause a rift, and right now a united Wessex with Mercia affixed to it is the only bulwark against the Danes and Norse. Northumbria could not overcome them alone, nor could Wessex." Finan asked her no more, just stroked her stomach as she closed her eyes. The sun was high when she opened them again, and Finan was still beside her. Was this a dream? Osrith asked herself, when she turned to him and kissed him on the lips to make sure. "No, then. You had a wife, once. Hethan." Finan shot her a look, but said nothing. "We were talking about wives." "No. Hethan. She died," Finan told her. But Osrith turned over, so he was in front of her. "And yet she was Find Laith's daughter, a princess of the Ailch. Anu I Neil." It was from the monastery books that Osrith had put that together. Finoli, she had saved. But Ethan? Domhnall's sister, Flan Sinner's first wife, who he got rid of by selling her to slavers at the beach by Team Reach. Osrith had shivered when she had found that out, and remembered seeing a short, squat man, with a whip, and men who would make sure there were no escapees as poor unfortunates were herded onto a rowing boat. Ethan was one of them, and she had made sure that she had fought as much as she could. Was she? Finan mused, and suddenly his face was far away. You know, she told me that herself, once. Her brother is Domhnall of the Ailch, her half-brother is Neil Glundube. In fact, Finan had been face to face with Domhnall at the Bernician Alba border, when the bargain had been struck. And then Finan laughed at her good joke. He clearly did not believe her, but Osrith knew that it must have been true. She had come from the slaver ship with Finan and Utad. Finan had taken her under his wing, so to speak. So you have no children? Osrith pressed. Finan did not answer, and she let the subject drop. And she wondered how long Utad and Finan had been back in Winchester, and she found that it mattered to her that she had been in the Etheling's company the previous night. When Finan stroked Osrith's hair, Osrith asked, "Why is Utad in Winchester?" "He was banished. He feels he must help defend it. There is a Danish army in East Anglia ready to attack." "Then I must rejoin the army," Osrith decided. "Perhaps you should wait until at least tomorrow morning," Finan replied, and hung on to her. For the first time, she realized that, beside his becircled cross, that was typical in Irian, a hole had been drilled into the coin that she had given back to Ragnar. He had kept their coin, Finan still had hoped that they would be together. And now Osrith's life was back to being complicated. "And you want to fight in an army?" "I will join," Osrith insisted. "Why?" asked Finan. "Because I like the things you do, food, clothes, shelter, ale." "I have never seen you drink ale," Finan replied, his hand on her waist. "Don't think I haven't noticed," Osrith thought, wryly. "And I like silver because it gives me choices. When I tire sooner than the men I command, I can afford to rest." "Never a child?" Finan persisted. Osrith shook her head. "Perhaps you were cursed, too," he whispered. "What?" Finan shook his head, for his mind had been elsewhere. "You? I hope any children I will father I will teach the lessons of life well to," he replied, relenting to the question now. "Like your father?" "King of the Ulaid," Finan declared. "Your father was a king?" Osrith declared, sitting up, running through her mind the names of the kings she had known, when she had been in Doia with Domhnall and Constantine. Finan laughed. "Not like kings here," he explained. "Kings in Ireland have maybe an area the size of Winchester, maybe a little more. There are a lot of kings." And Osrith thought back to those kings at Team Reach, Tara, and how many had stood before Flan Sinner and pledged their oaths. Had he been there, that day, Finan's father? She remembered the brightness, the warmth of the sun, how happy everyone was. And she remembered the man who has proposed that he, too, could be the next High King, who had challenged Flan Sinner. And he was a good father? Finan's fingers were smoothing through her hair, and Osrith pulled out Tyrex's jewel and clipped it to her shirt so as not to get it lost. "He would beat the shit out of me every day," Finan replied. "Me and my." He shook his head, then changed tack. Every lesson came with a fistful of fingers. Osrith shuddered, remembering the beatings she had had, across her back and buttocks and legs from Elfric. Her mind wandered ... King of the Ulaid. And put her fingers lightly to the side of his face. "I am happy that you are Edward's household guard rather than on the battlefield," Finan said, after a time. He kissed her but did not press her for more, although the kiss became deeper and she pressed her fingers to his temple, trailing it down his face. Then, she took hold of their coin. "I kept it for you," he said, as Osrith held it up so it caught the sunlight. Then she looked back to Finan. "Does Utad know you're here?" "I am allied to him, nothing more." And they held one another, until it was Finan's turn to sleep. Osrith moved out of his way as his dream became a nightmare, and he began to thrash about on her bed, calling out words, Galish words that she didn't understand, shaking and begging an invisible someone to let him go. It had happened before, when they had shared the hay together at Dunham, above the horses. Osrith thought about the time he had told her that he had bonded with Uhtred on a slave ship, and she thought now that the ship she had seen that morning when Ethan was taken and she had freed Finoli must have contained both of them, and she shuddered herself at the realization. If she were a different woman she may ask Finan by now to have abandoned Uhtred. But she had tasted battle and knew that bonds between warriors were not easily cast aside. Finan was Uhtred's man. Yet the day she had walked through the market square to the palace empty he had accosted him. Finan had stepped between them, and it had only been upon her initiation that they had ever come to blows. You made to return to Pitland, once. In the glory of the afternoon sunlight flooding through her window, Osrith turned to look at Finan. To Alba. If I go, I will be going to a land which had attained peace and prosperity, few nor attempt to take its cities. Guerrilla warfare and local lords protect every square inch of Alba. You'll come back? Finan said this urgently, and Osrith smiled. Yes, I will, she promised. Once it is done? Yes. In the north? Pitland? Yes. Finan stroked her hair. Tell me about your wife. Ethan, she prompted, half expecting Finan to clam up. But he took Osrith's hand and looked at her. She was angry with the slaver, and became thin, very thin. She fasted against the people who had sold her, her family. He looked at Osrith and half giggled. She would say, she was a Gaelish princess, it made me laugh. And now you know that it is true. And she told Finan of the morning that Ethnangen Finlaith Uineal was sold into slavery, the once queen to Flansinna, sold off to convenience his plan of marrying Finlaith's wife, Malmuir. He listened silently as his gigantic tale unfolded, then took Osrith in his arms when she had finished. And you were in Irian? With Domhnall MacCorstin, of House Alpin. A memory passed over Finan's features as something stirred in his own mind. Then he began to pull at her clothing, kissing her body as he exposed it, and Osrith knelt astride him. He held her hips parallel to his own, watching her rounded breasts move as she got into a rhythm. He remembered those, in a far distant corner of his mind. But soon those thoughts were put away as Osrith bore down on his hips, squeezing her cunt around his cock so that before long, he had exploded his seed into her, slowing down as he came, watching his face contort in ecstasy as waves of pleasure filled his body. Finan moved her over into his arms, holding her close, and then, moved her onto her back, Osrith's ankles on his shoulders. He returned the pleasure. 88,888,888. What do you want, Ethelwold? Uhtred had stopped his striding down a narrow street that led from the market to Thira's house. He turned, and placed his hands on his hips. In fact, whatever you have to say to me, I am not interested. Ethelwold stopped, but the expression in his face, slightly manic, made Uhtred think he hadn't heard him. I said. What would you do if I told you I knew the identity of the person who killed your wife? Ethelwold said, swaying slightly. Drunk, Uhtred thought. No one killed my wife, she died in childbirth, he replied. But Ethelwold gave him a manic grin. Yes, yes, that was what you were told, Ethelwold replied, and stepped forward to Uhtred as if his words were being shared in confidence. She died in childbirth. Uhtred repeated, pushing him aside, and I do not want to speak of it again with you. He walked past Ethelwold a few steps. But the pretender to the throne of Wessex turned. What would you do? Uhtred stopped walking, and turned back to face him. Hang him, cut him down while still alive, take his balls and make him eat them, make him swallow them, rip open his chest, remove his still beating heart, cut through his sinews and tie his limbs to 4 horses. Ethelwold nodded, as if Uhtred's words were weighing heavy as he considered things. That could be difficult. Why? Because although she fights as a man, she is still a she. Realization flooded Uhtred's face and he widened his eyes. You know of whom I speak? Ethelwold pressed. She? Killed Gisela? That Scottish bitch? Uhtred shook his head. I have seen how you look at her. No. He shook his head again. You are playing a game, Ethelwold. This is no game, Uhtred, Ethelwold replied, fervently. I have found something out. Supposing a girl fled her home and ended up in the fortress of the king of the Picts. Supposing she went in hiding with the princes, say nothing, for I am sure of what I know. Ethelwold held up a hand. Suppose the son died at her command, and she was compelled to drown, but spirited herself away back to Alba. He bent towards Uhtred again. Suppose she hates the Lord Uhtred for some slight and used her magic to destroy his wife. None of this could be substantiated, but most of the facts fitted, and it was a convenient lie. Say nothing more, Ethelwold. Uhtred replied. Because that sounds like nonsense to me. She has not fled to Alba, she is still here, as a warrior from Mercia. But Ethelwold looked insistent. I speak away from your Irishman, Uhtred. Alfred has decreed no margin on a tolerance on witches. It will be up to the king to decide, said Uhtred, shrugging his shoulders. If any of what you say has any truth to it. But Ethelwold was bearing down on Uhtred again. She gave Gisli herbs. Where did she get them from? If she is innocent she will admit it. And this caused Uhtred to pause, rather than take Ethelwold by the throat. When Sihtric had come back from his time masquerading as his enemy, and gone to the Danes for information, he had come back with a similar story, that a girl declared Kriegjakvind was the same woman who controlled the sun once to avoid being put to death as a witch. In Aryan. She was trying to help, or so she says, Ethelwold continued, simpering towards Uhtred. She was using a good deal of heathen magic. She is a witch they say. And she used heathen magic? And your child lived, Uhtred, but she did not save your wife. Why would that be? And that was enough to anger Uhtred of Bibbenberg. I will, he began. But Ethelwold shook his head. No. She is too well protected. She works inside the palace, stays there nights. With Edward, Uhtred snorted his disbelief. Steeper protects her, Aldham, Eth leered. Another snort, to indicate what Uhtred thought of them. Should she come to trial, she would be hanged, certainly, as pagans always are. Oh, there's the ordeal by ducking, or carrying a white-hot bar, or eating of tbiash cake. But your reputation, Uhtred. That of your wife. You deal with her, Uhtred snapped. As you described? Hang her, cut her balls. Remove her heart. Tear off her limbs? Uhtred thought for a moment. No, not in public. How so then, Lord Uhtred? And this time, Uhtred stepped towards Ethelwold, and whispered by his ear. Make her wish she was still in that god-forsaken country of Alba. Do what you will, Ethelwold, then kill her. A slow smile crept across Ethelwold's face. I had a more long-term solution in mind, Lord, that will draw out her pain over a long time, humiliate her every day for the rest of her life. You wish to take her? Uhtred pulled back and stared at Ethelwold. Yes, eventually. After I apostrophe played a while. He drew forward. You must get her to me, Uhtred. I will bring her, Uhtred promised, then strode away from Ethelwold as if he were an unsavory nuisance. And Uhtred thought about his words, as he thought about the words that his new lover had breathed into his ear that night, hasty, full of illegitimate pleasure. Osrith was a sorceress, or so it was said. Words, potent spells, which would mean the change in the course of her fate. Not hers, the lover, for Ethelfled who had found Uhtred in his old home and presumed her company on him, and then her body, her fate was fortune. Nothing would alter the course of her life now, and she knew it. So when she let herself be taken by the man with whom she was besotted, Ethelfled laid words beside his ears of a woman who had been conjured by the sea and doused the sun, just as she had told her brother earlier that day. And many pieces of information in a minute could be just that, fragments, unconnected. Or they may fuse together in many unlikely combinations, only one of which was a reflection of the truth. But did truth matter when it was far easier to believe the image that matched the reflection of a person's feelings? He hated Osrith for shaming him before Agnar, who was now dead, and he could not unite with him. He hated her for the interest his friend and comrade showed in her, something she could give him and Utad could not. Where was he that night, for example? And he hated most of all that she had bettered him in every conflict that had taken place between the both of them. Utad of Bibbenberg lay with Alfred's daughter tucked into the crook of her arm as he mulled the pieces. And decided that Osrith was indeed guilty of witchcraft and, worse, for murdering his wife. 88,888,888. As Utad was fucking Ethelfled, her brother was fingering Utad's sister. When Osrith had come, she lay next to Edward and listened to him tell her that Elflad complained that she was not yet pregnant, and that he hoped his 2 children were being cared for well at the nunnery they were in Mercia. Alfred was dying, and that was on his mind also, and he was angry, too, with Elflad's demands. She wants to be queen when he became king. You can do that for her, Osrith soothed. What do you know? He snapped back, and then looked instantly sorry. But then, his anger caused him to push Osrith away. I know that you could, she persisted, and Edward turned his back to her. Talk of being king meant that the present king would no longer be alive. Mercia had queens, Bibbenberg had queens. All of the Welsh kingdoms, but she broke off when Edward held a piece of paper towards her. It was in Gaelish, and must have fallen from her bindings in Edward's haste to get to her tits. What is this? He demanded. It is in Gaelish, I copied it from the scriptorium. The wrong thing to admit, Osrith realized as Edward got out of bed and stalked, still naked, across his room. Then he turned and held it towards her again. You were spying? In a way she had been, but Osrith shook her head, anyway as she, too, got up. It is a poem, Osrith replied, one I remember from the longest time ago. So, I copied it down. The wrong thing, and Edward hit her across the face. Osrith, not expecting it, reeled. Were the herbs my father had yours? He demanded. A healer had attended Alfred. But that was the first time Osrith had ever heard of it. I don't know what you. Another slap, but Osrith moved out of the way. If she knew she would not be hanged for assaulting a member of the royal family, she would have hit Edward back. Instead, she made for her clothes. But Edward stood in her way. But I know you hide silver. Do not deny it. It is my own, Osrith admitted, refusing to look from him. As you hid from me, once. And she dressed, and made to leave. But Edward took Osrith in his arms and began to kiss her, before breaking off and waving his hand towards her, and she took of her jerkin and shirt. All of which was too slow for him. Frantically, Edward began to pull down her bindings. When they wouldn't come, he yanked them down rather than off, and Osrith's breasts spilled out over the top, and bobbed near his face. No question, Osrith's hindbrain told her, as the Etheling snuffled and rooted her nipples, taking them every so often, and pulling them away then releasing them, and watching as they sprang back towards her, watching her face as her pleasure grew. When he wasn't doing that to one of them, his hand was on the other, twisting it backwards and forwards, then matching the pulling he was doing on the other one using his teeth. Osrith threw her head back in pleasure. He knew how much this mild pain from the Etheling's fingers and grinding teeth was pleasure enough to get her off, and she was immediately getting wet. But then he stopped, and backed away, watching the blush of arousal sweep across Osrith's chest, at her nipples, large and dark red from his proficient attention, and Osrith inhaled deeply, watching his face as it changed, becoming the moody, uncertain boy she once knew. You were in my father's chronicle, he accused, looking at her, crossly. Not just Gaelish. You have been searching for information about that northern land, Alba? What relationship do you have there? Are you a traitor? I am no traitor. Osrith's words were ragged and breathy, as she recovered herself. Edward's face was still stormy. I saw what you were reading, I have read what was said. Are you really a witch? I am not. Osrith insisted. She shook her head as Edward advanced on her. Do you think I am? Where had he heard it? Osrith's mind questioned. But her reply was not good enough for Edward, and he challenged, Is that why you took off, so desperate that you were to get there? I did not go. Osrith protested. But Edward looked at her, triumph on his face, as if he had caught her out in a lie. "No, you returned with the Danes, I know this." The Etheling backed off from her, looking at her strangely. "Tell me what you were doing there, tonight? At Crapelgate?" Osrith shook her head. "Britons live thee," he continued. "Is this where you get medicines from?" At his words, Osrith's whole life in Alba began to unfold in her mind, a swirling cloud of memories, with no start, and no end. Then, he dashed to her, and kissed her, hard, on the mouth, lovingly, as he had first done at Aylesbury, when they were becoming confidants to one another, and Osrith sank into his arms, her tits liberated by his hands, pressing to his chest as he wrapped his arms around her. When Edward finally stopped, he held her close, and she sighed into his shoulder. "Believe me, I did not," Osrith denied, and perhaps that was where her downfall began. "You are unsettled about your father." It was understandable. But Edward's arms stopped pulling her close, and he pushed her away as he stepped back. "My lord?" Osrith asked. But it was a considerable time before he spoke, and when he did, he muttered, "Osrith, I saw you." "My lord?" Osrith's heart beat faster, but Edward stood away from her, his face creased, like he was in some sort of pain. It took a moment for Osrith to find out what was causing his pain, and when she looked down waist height, she realized the Etheling had his cock in his hand, and was wanking himself furiously, as if the thriving or fall of Wessex depended in his orgasm. Osrith made to approach him, but with his other hand Edward slapped her face, making her reel. But she did not fall because Edward had grabbed her shoulder, and was gripping her, tightly. The Etheling looked at Osrith for a second, and made to kiss her, but then he stopped, and instead, pushed her towards wall by the door. Osrith yelled as the wood made her bump against it, and was about to push away when she realized that Edward was parting her legs with his hands and feeling her cunt, feeling for dampness as he pushed a finger a little way in, and circled her clitoris, as he used to do. Osrith shivered at the sensations. But that was clearly a mistake, and Edward drew her back and slammed her against the wall again. "No." Osrith protested. "Edward, no." But he either did not hear or ignored her, and within seconds his ample cock was in her, pressing her walls apart. At this angle, it was painful, and with his hands on her hips, pulling her onto him and riding her. Osrith began to think that he meant it to be. It wasn't long until he came, Edward's rhythm slowing down as his ejaculate welled inside her. But, when the Etheling broke away from her, he was coated in blood. It hung from his seed-coated cock, before dripping onto the floor, but Edward said nothing, and he wiped himself on a cloth. Osrith recognized it to be the blanket she used to sleep under, aware of the dampness on her inner thighs, and Osrith put her hand to it. When she drew it back, she was certain then what had caused it. "Edward," Osrith said, softer this time. But when he looked at her again, his eyes were full of sadness. Osrith turned, making to approach him, as a pain shot through her stomach. She had never felt such intensity before, and her heart sank as Edward held up a hand, as if defending himself from her. "Go." The word reverberated in her ears as she scrambled backwards, another wave of pain flooding her, and Osrith bent over, trying to counteract it. He had thumped her face. "Edward." "Go," I said. And he stamped a foot towards her, as one might stamp before a cat to scare them, and Osrith bundled out of the door, clothes in her arms, her old blanket around her, past an astonished Aldred. She turned to him, clothes pressed to her, and drove him to the wall, face to it. "You mention this to anyone and I will cut off your balls, got it?" Osrith asked. Then a contraction in her stomach made her dart down the corridor, not waiting for a reply. Aldred did turn, and noted with satisfaction his ex-captain's naked back view, noting her rounded buttocks as she tore away, and into the armory, which was, fortunately, empty. He was the reason Ethelwold had found out about the medicines from the Britons, for he had been on duty the day Steepa had given her the route back and warned her of the penalty of witchcraft. And Ethelwold had been amazingly generous. Osrith tore the blanket into strips, sandwiching some between her legs and got dressed, thoughts racing through her mind. The information from the Chronicle, the herbs. The fact that unless she concealed all she knew of the Britons, they could be taken and killed, like the pagans at Dunnottar had been. Most importantly, Osrith knew, she had to get away to deal with this hemorrhaging. And, whatever she said now, to anyone, would seem like an excuse. When she was dressed, Osrith made to stride through the practice ground, which would lead her to the main street of Winchester. Just got to get back to her lodging, which was a thought, Osrith realized, wryly, she never thought that she would ever be thinking. Which was why she did not notice an inebriated Utad advancing on her. You were with my woman when she died. His voice was quiet, his words a statement. Osrith, who said nothing, as her brain fought to engage some sort of defense as Utad's fist came in her direction. She flailed her arm and blocked Utad, his own arm colliding with the side of the wall. But it was a ruse, and Osrith felt herself being dragged by the wrist, as Utad held her hand over one of the torches held in a bracket beside the courtyard. She screamed and landed a kick into his groin. Stop them. Someone. A voice rang out, and Finan, Sihtric charged over to them. Steeper. Edward's words rang clear. Fetch Steeper. But Utad had not finished yet, as he caught both hands and brought Osrith to her knees. Spies are hanged. Witches, he savoured the word, hanged. But I am sure the king can make an exception for you. Where did you get the herbs, witch? Osrith turned her head, as if to be compliant, docile, and then leaned towards him, as if about to confess something. And if she told him, it would condemn all of the Britons who lived a knife-edge existence at Crapelgate, leaving for the west in dribs and drabs, as I'll and the silver to pay their passage. Her brother was grinning at her, the look of someone who feels they have won and need only the guilty party to confess their guilt. Osrith drew her head back and cracked her forehead against Utad's nose, and he fell backwards as Osrith got to her feet, withdrawing Buoy. To her right, Steeper stood, looking between them both, not knowing whether he was more astounded at Utad, the outlaw, being in Wessex, or Osrith busy assaulting him. I have murdered women for less, Utad screamed at her, jumping to his feet, serpent breath in his own hand. Osrith parried his blow, then plunged her blade towards his chest. It tore the fabric and grazed his ribcage. Your hatred of women is clear. She screamed back, as Utad began another onslaught. If you cannot dominate them by lying with them, you murder them, like Skade. Satisfaction, Utad did not know Osrith knew about the seer's death, by drowning, at his hand. As soon as they get stronger than you, it's the only way for you. Brider, for example. The cloth between her legs was now saturated with blood and Osrith could feel it collecting in her breeches. Not home, not now. Somewhere to deal with whatever this was. You know nothing about it. Screamed back Utad, and again, Osrith was satisfied. He was clearly denying the truth. Another blow from her brother, another defense, which caused his sword to skitter away. Osrith lowered Buoy. Don't let your mind wander. It's far too small to be out on its own. One or two people who the watching laughed. Utad. A woman's voice called in alarm. It was Hild, and behind her, Father Pyleague. Stop fighting, Utad. Edward's voice, intending to be commanding, ran between them. But it did not have the power his father's had. Utad lunged for her again but stumbled. Osrith swung her sword hilt into Hugh's chest and he staggered back, stunned for a moment. Steeper. This was Edward again. And if the guard got involved, there would be no explaining it, no matter how she had served everyone in the past. Men got another chance if they made an error of judgment, women got condemnation. She had to get out of there, she had to see Allah. Osrith made to hurry past Utad, but he had now got to his feet and lunged at her again. Osrith, in a bad position, lost her footing and flailed. Utad caught her shoulder and slammed her face against the wall. Something crunched, but Osrith broke free. You are a witch and killed my son. Utad hissed near her ear. If I had not tried something, your second son would have died. You should be grateful. "You're freed, Hild." But Osrith ran out of ideas as she caught the eye of the abbess. "What do you understand about birth except for conception?" But it had been too much. The blood from her uterus had soaked through her breeches now and a trail was forming on the flagstones. She ran, but did not get very far until she collapsed into the street just outside the palace. 88,888,888. She has gone too far. Allah, with an unconscious Osrith in her home, frowned at Finan. She closed the curtain behind Osrith and stood before Finan. "I warned her." Finan looked between Allah and the curtain. He had followed her once, and knew that part of Utad's accusation may be true. "Did you do this to her? She is bruised, battered. Whoever did this to her... I cannot save the child." Finan's mouth fell open. "The child? There is a child?" Allah folded her arms. "Can you save her?" he asked, frantically. "Please, I will do anything." Allah looked towards Osrith again, her arms still folded. Pagans never did anything for nothing. "Silver, I have silver. I can get silver." But Allah sighed, as she moved towards her cooking pot. "She may be beyond silver. Leave her with me." And the Briton waited for Finan to go. But Finan stood there, and refused, so Allah relented and pointed to a chair. 4 days Finan waited, until Osrith regained enough strength to sit up, and Allah explained that whatever she had taken had unwittingly begun an expulsion of what would be a child. When she could walk, Finan, true to his word, returned with silver, enough to make even Allah's eyes widen, and he carried Osrith back to her lodging. After a week of looking after her, sending even Osferth away, Finan finally got her to sit on her own, and sat next to her. "That bastard Edward did that to you," he said, when she could finally drink some warm goat's milk. Osrith did not deny it. Osferth came back the next day, and Finan sent him away again. But Aldhelm gained entry, and Finan stood, his arms folded at the end of Osrith's bed as the Mercen Lord, her friend, spoke to her. "What happened?" Aldhelm asked Osrith. She was about to speak, when Finan stepped towards him. "That fecking shite of an Ethling happened, that's what." And then, adjusting Soul Stealer, Finan strode to the door. "Look after her, while I go and beat the shit out of him." It was a lie to say that, on the day above Bibbenberg's beach 10 years in the future had been the first time he and Utad had fought over Osrith. Then, he would be telling his best friend that he was her sister, just before he was about to shoot an arrow at her. To be fair, Osrith had just burned up the only evidence that existed that Utad was the heir to Bibbenberg. That was the second, this was the first. Finan had already headbutted Steeper and made the man reel as he charged through the courtyard and was almost at the hall gates when Utad landed such a punch, enough to stop the Irishman in his rage. "What happened?" Utad demanded, a question he repeated several times, and Finan failed to answer. "Take him to my home, and keep him there," Utad told Osferth and Citric, but Finan was in no mood to be taken. Instead, glaring with hatred at the palace walls, he stalked away. Perhaps that should have been the end of the matter, and Utad would forget that Finan had been missing from his side for nearly a week. Worse, it had been with her, that nuisance who was always around them. That nuisance who, as Ethelwold had been unusually correct about. For Osrith had not denied witchcraft to Utad, and he had asked her several times. She was a Kriegjökvind, and one woman such named had had the power to make the sun disappear. If a witch was powerful enough to do that, then they were powerful enough to make herbs with such efficacy that they would kill a vulnerable woman in childbirth. Utad thought all of that as his best friend stalked away, his concerns being not Utad for once. And so, he was resolved, their witch merely had to be brought to another earldorman for justice, the king did not even need to be bothered. For, why should Gisla's excursions to the Britons be brought into disrepute? And Thyra's? So he was resolved. And he would wait. Until there was no other option for Osrith Lackland to submit to the lord in question. Utad knew it would be a pleasure to watch justice be carried out in Wessex, at last. But, it would not take Finan from him. Utad, ordering his men to follow Finan, chased after him, and it took them months deeper to restrain him before he got to Prince Edward. 88,888,888. Ethelwold, who would get drunk very quickly that night, would tell someone who would tell someone else, and so on, that Osric was a witch who could drown the sun, and also killed Lord Uthod's wife. Uthod, on the other hand, after a swift, but productive argument with Finan after taking him to the edge of the city to remind him of his oath, and the circumstances that had caused Finan to declare that oath. When Finan had returned, Uthod would find the very person who would, after the next chapter, tell him who really killed Ragnar. But that is the future. Tonight, revenge was uppermost in the Lord Uthod's mind as he came along with deep resentment that someone he did not know, a woman, no less, had violated his relationship with his wife, with his best friend. He plotted. And so, dead of night, came to where Osric slept a fortnight later, alone, with no one following him, for Uthod had made sure he had paid for the best horse for them all, and, having punched her enough times in her stomach that he felt satisfied, dragged her to a palace dungeon, as a now very sober Ethelwold was waiting for Osric Lackland. Ethelwold had been patient, and now she was his reward. And he had lived long enough with the Danes long enough to have learned some very entertaining ways with which to extract information.